Hey there, my name is Trolls. Welcome to Soundpaint. A week ago, I made a video about artificial intelligence and its impact on music, and you guys just had the most interesting comments. So I thought it could be cool to do a video here where we just go through your comments and we talk a little more about all the different angles to this complicated subject. The key phrase, it's just a tool. It's the potential element of creativity. We are the kinetic element. Without us, there's silence. What a sweet comment. I've yet to hear an AI that really generates cool music. I think they're, to this point, mindless robo BPM poor loop generators. The fidelity is lower. We can argue how important fidelity is, but we should also start thinking about what was it really trained on? Where did Suno and other companies get their data? It's like this sort of, we can't talk about it. And whenever you hear interviews with a lot of people working on that side of AI, they never want to disclose their data sets. But in music, it's pretty simple. We all own our source recordings. So in that sense, the second someone starts training on them or sampling from them, they are using our source recordings either to learn or to sample. It may come down to the courts are going to have to define what does that mean? What does training really mean? Is it the same as sampling? Is it the same as stealing? I would argue that if you train on data, you are sampling the data in the same sense that you're sampling it for musical purpose, you're sampling it to create something. So yes, you are using the source material, and I hope, really hope sincerely, that's the way the courts are going to decide. I would hope and love our competent lawmakers to really take this serious, because if we go down a couple of generations down the line, we'll now have data that's been trained upon multiple times, and then all of a sudden it's going to be super hard to figure out where did this actually come from? Is there a true source? It can all be smoke and mirrors at that point. AI is better at chess than humans, but it's still more interesting to watch humans play versus humans. Humans have always been fascinated by other humans in every domain. Isn't that what it ultimately comes down to? Us being humans? I also think someone else talked about as well, the creation process of touching something. How boring just to click a button and think that we created something. For me, the spiritual, intellectual curiosity comes from failing and trying out stuff and going on an exploration in the mind and in the sound as well. We need to swim in the waves to feel them. We can't just click buttons all day long. I almost find it the most boring way possibly to creative is just to click a button, as if I was just sitting in a factory and just checking out the candy as it comes on a conveyor belt. Oh, that one, dude. How boring. Aside from it not understanding music theory, and AI doesn't understand the germ of creation that comes from childhood, pain, love, loss, fear, because it'll never be able to experience that. At best, it'll only be able to simulate it. All of an individual human's artistic creations are the sum of his or her experiences, good or bad. Yeah, I'm thinking about the raw human expression. Even if AIs can sing, and they can do that right now, we've actually had that technology for many years. I think it's Dreamtonic has this beautiful tool called Soundp. It's actually one of the first trained AIs that can sing. And it's great. It'll get us 80% there. But it's always a little bit flat, kind of like a sterile backup singer, if you will. And I think when it comes to that raw human expression, we totally have to train deeply on it, and we have to train on a specific individual and really get into their voice. And it's amazing with Soundp. They've been at it for almost 10 years now, and it's still cool and beautiful, but it has a little bit of that sort of artificial Vocaloid kind of quality to it, which is totally its own aesthetic. And maybe that's another way of looking at AI. It could be that it's going to provide ample inspiration for new styles of music. Perhaps there's some fusions out there to be found because we didn't put the wires together ourselves. Which brings me back to my favorite subject, which is imperfection. The problem with AIs, in many senses, is that they're so perfect. Everything is plastic vanilla. If you look at the image generators, they're super cool, but they always have a little bit of sort of a Botox-like quality to them. And if you ask them to do wrinkles, they overdo the wrinkles. There's no sense of subtlety or just a true understanding of what constitutes perfect imperfection. One feature I'd love to see is AI-based instruments. One day, something akin to infinite round robin each time you press the key. Yeah, yep. Staccatos don't really need more than that. You're totally right. Soundpaint actually has some of that built into its own file format. I spoke a little bit about in the other video. The AI inside of Soundpaint is there for a reason. our very file format is actually designed to do these sort of things. For example, we have infinite velocities on the keys. So when you play a piano, you actually get 127 different velocities. We're doing similar things with round robin. So in that regard, we're getting closer to it. But I understand what you mean when it really comes with a true AI generating this in live. And I want to mention that as well. When people talk about like AIs and music and all that stuff, like they're all running on clouds right now, and none of them could run on a local computer. They're way, way too resource consuming to even have running on a power computer as well. So the idea of having 400 playable instances of auto round robin generating legato, staccato, whatever it is a far-fetched premise right now. We need to have completely new generations of computers, new chipsets, new technologies. Soundpaint is going to be one of them, but it's going to take a while to get there. And what I'm focusing on right now is try to figure out the right bridge to get there. We need to move the field forward. I think sampling has been pretty static for the last 2 decades almost. It's sort of the same thing, round robin, velocity layers, legatos. We're going into round robin based legato and all that stuff, but how can we push it further? How can we truly get close to the holy grail of realism? My premise is by the end of this year, we'll be there with Soundpaint, but more on that later. Regarding the Sound of John Williams issue, I was previewing a Bernard Herrmann's sample library a while back and began thinking about the issues of personal authenticity regarding sample libraries, making one like an epic composer. Yeah, a great sample library, and I kind of dread that term, sample library. Ideally, they should be instruments. They should be beautiful, playable, inspirational instruments. They may not ever be as cool as their acoustic counterparts. There's just something inherently so beautiful about picking up an acoustic instrument and touching it, and the human experience of that as well. But I do think you bring up an important point that we don't want to have sort of typecasted libraries too much, where you can only do that thing with it, or only sound like that composer. But I guess it's about how it's put together. Herrmann used certain principles in orchestration that can be done at a wider level. So as long as it's not just like click a button and sound like Herrmann, I think it could be very interesting to have more sort of old school romantic kind of string writing tools, for example. There's a lot to be learned from the great masters. I'm working on a project right now that's going to come out a little later this year, which is in the same vein of thinking, but really think more about like, well, what would a master have? What tools would a master have available to him, and how would he write with them? And then offer myself and you hopefully the same tools to see what would happen once we have all the samples that likely a great master would operate with in some of their greatest pieces. Music, like poetry, comes from the embodied soul, which is why AI cannot produce music or poetry. You know, Lee, this is an interesting comment. I had a friend who used ChatGPT to write a poem for his mom on her 70th, and she was in tears and said it was the most beautiful thing ever written. So have we passed the Turing test? Is it capable of producing poetry? I want to say like the large language models, ChatGPT, for example, Claude and others, are closer perhaps in the world of poetry, even though it's probably a little bit plastic poetry still. But in the sense that they've trained on the entire web, all written text. They've read every Shakespeare, the Bible, whatever you have out there, from Harry Potter to advanced literature, Ulysses, James Joyce, whatever. Because most of those AIs are based on this weight on word principle, it does seem like it has a capacity to scratch the doors of something poetic at times. It's still just a tool. It still needs to be refined, and ideally, even if it becomes like a poetry generator, I think it's important that one puts one's own touch on it. When it comes to music, as I mentioned in the previous video, it's a different form of language. It does not apply in terms of weights, at least that we know of, like a big language model would do. And we don't really know a lot about the language of music. If you think about theory, it's sort of like we can speak about it or write about it, we can read notation, but there's so much more to it in terms of expression. Maybe that's what you mean with poetry as well. It's not just writing down the words, it's also how we express them as well. The weight in our intonation. I saw a fascinating lecture with a professor from MIT. She was talking about emotions and how complicated it is, even for a computer to understand emotions. We can cry in tears, we can laugh in tears. Stuff like facial gestures don't always mean what we think they do. We can have contradicting emotions. Through a prompt, I make music. Can you tell me where the pleasure in doing this lies? Creative act itself is something magnificent. And I agree, man. I totally agree. It's kind of like the difference between like having a screensaver of a beach and going to the beach and feeling the sand through our toes and the wind and everything. I actually think with all these technologies, and Lord knows I'm surrounded by them myself, but it just makes me yield more for reality, you know? What better than to feel the cold ocean water on one's feet, like while watching a sunset and eating an ice cream, you know? We had Beethoven's 10th performed in Germany, written by an AI with a lot of human help. It was a novelty that wore off quickly. As far as I know, it's not been performed again. It's so true. For example, Google had one where they trained on Bach, every single piece he'd ever done, and it would just spit out mindless Bach pieces, but they weren't cohesive. And I think when it comes to the language of music, the ability to weave a meaningful thread through the music is not inherently something that we have articulated yet in meaningful words. And in the language of music, I find like one of the reasons we're having so many dialogues online and in the entire community is like no one has really figured out like the golden recipe. Sure, there's stuff like pop music where there are certain recipes that seems to be the tried and true, but then we're sort of down to the McDonald's for the ear. And I say that with great praise for pop music, by the way. I love the production values and all that stuff, but it does not mean that it's propelling the art form forward, though it's propelling production techniques forward. But I do think that there's going to be a day where AI, particularly if it's trained the reversed way, starting with waveforms, going up to instruments, and then going into compositional elements, that it will understand how humans express musically at some point. I just happen to think that we have to build it from the bottom and up, not from top down. It's not like you can just play music or send in MIDI files and it'll just understand it. Like there's so much more to it. All the pieces I love the most when it comes to music are all very expressive and have a very unique voice and identity to them. And for me, until it understands human emotion, it's just going to be this data-driven blabbing MIDI nonsense. With the AI age of music, the process of making music is no longer important, just the output. Most listeners don't care about the process by default. You're right, most people do not care about how it was made. The same can be said about every other thing in life. When I have a meal, I may not care exactly about how the process was done, but for example, I care about what ingredients we use because it makes it taste better. Sometimes there's inherent things that we don't even need to know, but it does make a difference. For example, when we use high production values in music, meaning high-level ingredients across all chains, whether it's your instruments or it's your mastering plugins or whatever it is you use, hardware or software, you try to aim to use the finest ingredients because the likelihood of you creating a great piece of music, a great meal, are higher that way. There's inherently just something in there that happens in the creation process that makes it different. I think you're right. If we were just to have like stock music generators that would just pump out music and sort of try to hit people with them, whatever, sure, we could probably automate that process right now and just have mindless pseudo songs pumped out, and at some point some shit is gonna stick to the roof. But is it really gonna take off? Think about performers, like they have to be out there and sing. People don't want to see a computer perform. They want to see a human. They want to smell the other humans. They want to just be a part of a social experience. I was reading about the loneliness pandemic right now, which they deem might be higher and more dangerous than smoking itself. Can you imagine a world where everything is just being outputted by AIs and we're not even together? You know, I think the social aspect of music, being together, seeing someone perform, touching a real instrument, touching the knobs in your DAW. I actually think one of the issues with the DAW is we can't touch it enough. It's just this sort of stiff two-dimensional plate, and I can use my controller to try express myself. But versus that in real life, picking up an instrument and really performing, it's so different. So the process of making music is important if it comes to true expression. I really don't think an AI is capable of expressing all the beautiful imperfections and the nerve and tension of a human being. And as I mentioned earlier as well, the ability to weave a cohesive thread through the music is also something it doesn't understand. So I think you're right when it comes to like the McDonald's for the ear, the mindless BPMs just pumping out in the eternal ether of nothingness. Sure, you win. But when it comes to the process of creating something personal for me, it's actually the process of creating it that's the most fun part. It's not even like when it goes out and all that stuff. It's more just the challenge, whether it's my soul or my intellect or whatever, to try to figure out how to create something beautiful. And in that context, I just see AI as a tool. If it can help me get there, fine. But I want to touch it. I don't want to click a button and just have a meal come out. Like, I want to cook it. I want to grind my own coffee beans. I want to smell the world and feel it, use all my senses to the maximum amount of degree. If I'm just a button pusher or a doom scroller and mindless music, it won't make a difference. So maybe that's what it's all about. Maybe it's about making a difference in the process of creation, in the dialogues we have together. Just try to embrace this technology, but as a part of human life. It's just a tool.